Jay. Good morning. Welcome to a very exciting event sponsored by our International Law Students Association, who are studying international law and national security. We're very, very fortunate to have a terrific event featuring our own Judge Baker and another non-proliferation expert, James Lawler, who is going to be joining us via Zoom. They're going to be terrific speakers. They are really expert in the area of policy, and I'm sure we're going to learn a great deal. Point of order is that if you're online and you've got a question, it should be in by 12:15, and they'll be collected and they will be brought down to the speakers. So we have some fabulous, fabulous speakers, and our distinguished host is Professor James E. Baker. He's the director of the Syracuse University Institute for Security, Policy, and Law. He's professor at the College of Law in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. He's a distinguished fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, Georgetown University. He previously served as a judge and the chief judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. This court's a federal civilian court that hears cases arising from the military justice system. Appeals from this court go to the United States Supreme Court. Judge Baker also served as a presidential appointee under the Obama administration and acting chair of the Public Interest Declassification Board. As a career civil servant, he was the legal advisor and deputy legal advisor to the National Security Council. He's also served as the President's Counsel for Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board and the Intelligence Oversight Board, and as an attorney for the Department of State. He's also been an aide to the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan and served as a Marine Corps infantry officer. In 2017, 2018, he was a Robert E. Wilhelm Fellow at the Center for International Studies at MIT. In addition to teaching at Syracuse, he's taught at Yale, Iowa, Pittsburgh, Washington University in St. Louis, and Georgetown. He's the author of many articles in 3 books: The Center's Dilemma, National Security Law for the Coming AI Revolution, and The Common Defense, National Security Law for Perilous Times, and with Michael Reisman, Regulating Covert Action. Our honored guest, James Lawler, has served as a national security consultant and is the senior partner of MDO Group, which provides HUMIT training to the intelligence community and the commercial sector focused on weapons of mass destruction, cyber intelligence, technical and cyber issues. Mr. Lawler is a noted speaker on the insider threat in government and industry. Prior to this, he served 25 years as a CIA operations officer in various international posts and was chief of the Counter Proliferation Division Special Activities Unit. He also was a member of the CIA Senior Intelligence Service from 1998 until his retirement in 2005. He was a specialist in recruitment of foreign spies and spent well over half a CIA career battling proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. As chief of the AQ-Khan nuclear takedown team, which resulted in the disruption of the most dangerous nuclear weapons network in history, Mr. Lawler was a recipient of the CIA's Trailblazer Award in 2007, marking the 60th anniversary of the CIA. He's also received the Director's Award from DCI George Tenet and the U.S. Intelligence Community's HUMIT Collector of the Year Award and the Donovan Award from the CIA's Deputy Director of Operations. Prior to his career intelligence, he practiced law and was a president of a steel company in Texas. He's a graduate of Rice University and the University of Texas Law School. He's also an author. He's completed 2 novels, Living Lies, an espionage story of the Iranian nuclear weapons program, and In the Twinkling of an Eye, about recruiting a spy at the heart of the devastating covert Russian, North Korean genetic bioweapons program. He's currently writing his 3rd espionage novel, The Traitor's Tale, which is about treachery deep within the CIA. So we've got a terrific group of panelists, and the floor is yours, Judge Baker.
Thank you very much, Professor Day. We miss you. It's good to see you back.
Thank you.
And it's a real pleasure to be here today because some of you in the audience may know this, you may suspect it, but I'm here to affirm it for you. Jim Lawler is one of America's heroes. I encourage you to go onto the CIA website where you surf most of your days anyway, and look under the title of Trailblazer and see who else has been awarded the Trailblazer designation. And that's the company that Jim Lawler and his AQ Con team keep. That's impressive. Perhaps even more impressive, which is an inside joke that only Jim and I might understand. He's gotten 2 books through the PRB, the Publication Review Board, and that's a Medal of Honor type challenge. So, and they're actually good books. They're not just blank pieces of paper, which would be the preferred method to get something through. So well done on that, Jim. And here's what I'd like you to know about Jim. He's one of the good guys. You could always count on him to always have what was in the best interest of the United States at heart when he was briefing something, was when he was involved in something. And what he was involved with was the most important issues of national security, which was preventing weapons of mass destruction from being obtained, or the capability to make weapons of mass destruction from coming into the hands of bad actors. So for that, we thank Jim. My job today is to ask Jim questions. He's a professional. He'll know how to regulate what he says. So to say it in a manner that is both interesting but protective of the mission. And I've grouped my questions into 3 themes. One theme is counterproliferation, nonproliferation. One theme is current events. And one theme is Jim's career in the intelligence field. So I'm going to start there, Jim, if I could, unless you have any opening statement or remarks you'd like to make on the record, or you can submit your opening statement and we will ensure that it is provided in the record. Okay, so Jim, my first question for you is, you joined the CIA in 1980, was it?
That's correct.
Okay, tell us what prompted you to join the CIA. You apparently weren't satisfied with the law, so tell us why you joined the CIA and what you found when you did.
Well, my initial contact, Jamie, was almost by accident. I was in my last year of law school, and those of you in the audience here, if you're a last year student, there's only one thing on your mind, and that's, how about finding a job? And so I was interviewing with law firms, and the CIA came to the University of Texas School of Law campus, basically looking for attorneys for our Office of General Counsel. And the CIA needs to have attorneys, just like any other big organization, to try and keep us on the straight and narrow and keep us out of trouble. And I went to this interview with this former case officer. Here he is. He's trying to hire attorneys for the CIA. And he looked at me and he said, "Jim, have you ever thought about the clandestine service?" Now, this was 1976. The CIA did not even have a sign out on Route 123 that said what it was. And I said, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know what the clandestine service is." And he said, "Well, Jim, I can't tell you much about it, but I think you'd be really good at this." So I filed that away in the back of my head, but realistically, it really wasn't in the cards because tragically, my wife's mother was very ill at the time in 1976. And the chances that we would be going to Washington and then overseas in a CIA career were little to none. So I returned the application that he had given me the next day to him. And instead of that, I went into a family-owned business. I don't know how many of you have ever been in a family-owned business or are contemplating it, but there's a good reason why I'm no longer in a family business, and it focuses on that word family, that F word family. I love my brothers and my dad, but I was miserable. I made a lot of money, and I found out from an early stage in my life that you can make a lot of money and not be happy. It was not fulfilling. And so after about 3.5 years of complaining, my wife finally had it up to here, and she said, Jim, either do something about it or stop your belly aching. And so I had kept Mr. Bill Wood's card. I wrote him a letter, said 3.5 years ago when we chatted, I wasn't ready for the opportunity you were offering to me, but now I am. And within 2 or 3 days, I received a phone call from a young woman who never used the initial CIA. She never said, she said, you wrote Mr. Wood a letter a few days ago, and he would really like to see you if you're available next Thursday at 3 p.m. at the Holiday Inn on the Gulf Freeway. And I said, yes, ma'am, I can be there. And so I went to this interview. We spoke for 2 hours. He says, I'd like to fly you to Washington. And a couple of weeks later, I flew to Washington, had 3 days of initial interviews. Then I came back, and about 3 months after that, they asked me to come back for the polygraph, for the examination with the psychologist and the psychiatrist. The Lord knows how I got through that, but I did. And a few weeks after that, they offered me a job as a CIA operations officer. And the bizarre thing was, I had no idea, absolutely no idea what a CIA operations officer does. But I was so desperate to get out of Houston, Texas, and away from the family business that I would have taken a job somewhere on the planet Neptune if it had been offered to me. And so we packed up our car, moved to Washington in February of 1980, and it soon became apparent to me what the CIA wanted me to do. And to be blunt about this, and I'm a fairly blunt person, as Judge Baker probably knows, what the CIA expected me to do was to manipulate people, to exploit people, to subvert people, to suborn people, to convince them to betray a trust, to commit espionage. And those are all pejorative terms, manipulation, subornation, subversion. And yet I found out that not only was I pretty darn good at it, I enjoyed it. And I guess that shows you the kind of the semi-sociopathic nature of some CIA officers. In fact, a psychiatrist friend of mine says, Lawler, you're nothing but a sociopath, but one within lanes. Those lanes are US laws. And I had Judge Baker and other attorneys to keep me within those lanes. So anyways, that's how I started at the CIA. And I loved my 25-year career.
Well, you begged, what made you good at it other than being a sociopath in your own terms?
I'm a naturally curious person. I would talk to anybody. I'm a slight extrovert. I mean, we basically tend to find either slight extroverts or slight introverts work best as operations officers for recruiting. I have 2 brothers. One is an extreme introvert, meaning he won't talk to you. He's scared. And my other brother is an extreme extrovert, and he sucks the oxygen out of the room. But and you don't recruit people when you're in transmit mode. You recruit people by listening and finding out what's the stress in their life, and how can I relieve that stress. And so I was, I guess, talented in detecting stress from people. Sometimes it could be right away. Other times it would take me years. One target took me 11 years to recruit. So he didn't have detectable stress early in my relationship with him, but over time it developed until finally I attracted him to a third country. It took me about 30 seconds to break cover and say, I know you probably suspected that I might not be truly a State Department officer, and I apologize for any deception. But within 30 seconds, I'd recruited this gentleman because then he needed me.
Very candid, thank you. So your field, your specialty in the end was counterproliferation, nonproliferation. In this field, we have offense and we have defense. And I that's how I frame it. You can defend by having export control lists and prevent things from getting transferred overseas. But offense is going and getting this stuff when it falls into the wrong hands or interrupting people who are trying to get it. I understand that was your role, Jim. And I was wondering if you could start by telling us who A.Q. Khan was. He died a year ago. Who was he?
A.Q. Khan is a fascinating figure. He's been kind of my bête noire for the last 15 years, or actually since about 1998. He was a Pakistani who received his doctorate in metallurgy in the Netherlands, and he went to work for a company called Urenco. Urenco is a consortium of the Dutch, the Germans, and the British, and they produce ultracentrifuges for the enrichment of uranium, primarily for peaceful purposes, peaceful nuclear power purposes. And so he was an expert in metallurgy, and he was concerned about the fact that India had detonated an atomic weapon in the early 70s. And so he contacted the Pakistani government and offered to steal these highly restricted designs of these ultracentrifuges that his company had and take those back to Pakistan and develop a uranium enrichment capability for the Pakistani government. There's only essentially two primary routes to an atomic weapon. It's either highly enriched uranium or plutonium. And for highly enriched uranium, the easiest way to do that is to have what they call uranium enrichment facilities, where you gradually enrich the uranium from its less than 0.7% of the U-235 isotope that you need up to somewhere between 80 and 90%, which is weapons grade. And at that point, with the right design, you can have a nuclear weapon.
Tell us more. So what other things did A.Q. Khan get into? So he was working for the government of Pakistan at one point. Is
That's
that
correct.
the only person he was working for?
Well, as it turned out, no. He had become a national hero in Pakistan by giving them the Islamic bomb. And along about 98 or so, and I don't know if it was his ego, the man was extremely egotistical, or what, he decided to take proliferation private. Now, the CIA had never seen anything like this. We had seen country to country transfers of technology, transfers of weapons of mass destruction technology. We had never encountered a private individual such as Dr. Khan and his network of individuals back in Europe that would then contact other governments and offer to sell them a turnkey facility for a nuclear weapons program. But my team, we were fortunately in the right place at the right time in the Middle East, and they came across our screen, and we were able to penetrate his network and recruit sources inside of the network and ultimately bring them down.
Who was he working with, Jim? Who were some of the illicit people or illicit governments or entities that he was trying to make deals with?
It was initially Libya. And you have to remember, in the year 1998, Libya was a state sponsor of terrorism. So this was like the sum of all fears, that an unstable dictator like Muammar Gaddafi would acquire a nuclear weapons capability. It already had a certain amount of missile technology and chemical weapons efforts. And now he was going full bore for a nuclear weapon, which was unacceptable for the United States, for Libya to acquire a nuclear weapon. And so that was the initial customer. And there was talk later, when we had penetrations of the network, there was talk of going out to a second customer. So this was not going to stop with Libya. It was going to be something that Dr. Khan was going to peddle this technology to selected clients, shall we say, around the Middle East. It's a non-proliferation nightmare.
Now, your efforts ultimately were successful. You were known as the A.Q. Khan takedown team. What does it mean to take him down? He died in Pakistan last year. Describe takedown?
Well, we acquired irrefutable, unambiguous proof of what he was doing. And then this led to what back in the year 2003, there was a diversion of a ship that was known as the BBC China. It was chock-a-block full with hundreds of thousands of uranium enrichment components, and working with the British, the Italians, and the Germans, we had the ship diverted to a southern Italian port of Taranto, where 5 40-foot containers were discovered filled with these nuclear components. Now, at the same time, a effort was going on between the Libyans and the United States and Great Britain, where Colonel Gaddafi had come to a certain degree of lucidity and decided it was better to be a friend of the United States than an enemy, like his Arab cousin Saddam Hussein, who was about to be invaded. And so there had been preliminary negotiations between the Libyan government, the British intelligence service, and the CIA, but these negotiations were going nowhere because the people on the Libyan side, the nuclear negotiators, were stonewalling and continuing to claim quite vigorously that they had absolutely no nuclear weapons program, until the BBC China revealed that they were 5 40-foot containers full of nuclear components were sitting now in the port of Tripoli. One of my good friends, the CIA lead negotiator, Ray Richardson, he said, then how do you explain the 5 40-foot containers sitting in the BBC China, not even a mile from here, filled with these nuclear components? He said at that point you could hear the air conditioning, and that was all you heard. And the Libyans called for a quick recess. They went out, they came back, and they said something to the effect, well, praise Allah, you're right, we do have a nuclear program. And that led to a rapid disarmament of the Libyans, and basically the program came down. And then we also worked with a number of governments bringing the elements of the AQ-Con network to justice.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Lotta, how are we going to do questions? Are we going to take them now or as we go along, or at a certain point? Okay. Okay, so that sounds like a good plan. However, if there's something Jim says that you want to follow up on immediately, that's not a new question, but you want to follow up on something he said, you can go ahead and raise your hand and I will call on you. But in the absence of such follow-up at this time, I want to get you to step back one step. We went tactical and looked at AQ-Con and his network. But you were in the counterproliferation business more generally. So let me ask you 2 questions about that. In your role, what was your mission in the area of counterproliferation? What were you going after? What were you trying to prevent? What should our audience know about that? And then I'm going to ask you a follow-on question.
That's good. Okay, so classically, weapons of mass destruction include nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, and then delivery systems such as missiles that would deliver a weapon of mass destruction. Some people argue that a chemical weapon is not a weapon of mass destruction, it's more of a weapon of local destruction. Be that as it may, it was included in our purview of things that we were trying to prevent the spread of this technology around the world, because the more people who possess a nuclear weapon or a biological weapon, it increases the chances almost logarithmically that someone is going to use these weapons in anger or by accident. And our mission was not simply non-proliferation, stopping it, but counter-proliferation, which is where you try and set them back. And I found this to be one of the most satisfying things in my entire career. I continue to teach a few courses in the intelligence community, and I always tell my students that working against weapons of mass destruction, that is psychologically righteous. That is something to know that you can prevent the spread of a nuclear weapon. The weapon that Libya was interested in had a yield of 14 kilotons. That's 14,000 tons of TNT. It's the same yield that destroyed Hiroshima and killed 140,000 people. I think that's significant. That's important. And to be able to do that and prevent the, these nations, be they rogue nations or whatever, from acquiring these nuclear weapons or biological weapons, I think is absolutely essential to our national security and the world's security.
Okay, so back then, what literally and metaphorically kept you up at night, and with all that you know, what keeps you up at night now?
Well, I literally woke up after we had penetrated the AQCon network and saw the degree of what he was doing. I would literally wake up a couple of times. I remember this, woke up and I thought, I've at the same time, I think I have accomplished the most significant thing in my intelligence career, but I've opened the gates to hell. I mean, this is absolutely a nightmare. How do I stop this? And then ultimately, when we found out that not only were they dealing in equipment, but designs for a nuclear weapon, a 14 kiloton nuclear weapon, we had the actual designs. Everybody on my team had to get what we call a Q clearance to be briefed into the fact that we now had nuclear weapons designs. I briefed President Bush, and shortly after he was inaugurated, and George W. Bush, I briefed him and I told him, Mr. President, we have so much information on nuclear weapons that if we wanted to, we could take the CIA nuclear. And our Deputy Director of Operations, Jim Pavitt, quickly interjected and said, Mr. President, we wouldn't do that, however. So, but it was, here, this was keeping me up at night. What do I do? I've discovered this. How do we stop it?
And what about today?
Today, I think the thing that keeps me up at night would be the possibility, however slight, that Vladimir Putin might use tactical nuclear weapons in the Ukraine, out of desperation or a fit of pique. And that is a scary prospect. Also, the Iranian nuclear weapons or nuclear program, if they go nuclear, sure, I'm concerned about Iran possessing a weapon, but they, again, are not irrational people. They realize that Israel, which is not far away, certainly has undeclared, but absolutely, we know they have lots and lots of nuclear weapons. I don't see the Iranians launching a weapon at Israel. What I do see, however, is the strong possibility that other countries in the region, such as Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the Emiratis, and others, would decide if the Iranians are going to have a weapon, we have to have a weapon too. And that, again, increases the chances that someone will use this either accidentally or intentionally, and that would be an absolute nightmare.
Do you think the risk of Putin authorizing the use of a tactical nuke has increased with the Ukrainian offensive in the Kharkiv region?
Absolutely. In fact, I was at a dinner on Saturday night with former Deputy Director Michael Morrell, with the former head of our CTC, Counterterrorist Center, Weapons of Mass Destruction Department, Rolf Moat Larsen, and an Israeli expert. And we all were troubled by the fact, I'm happy for the Ukrainians that they're having a successful offensive against, a counterattack against the Russians, expelling them. But this naturally will increase the chances that Vladimir Putin will think that he's shoved into a corner, and that this could lead to his deposal. It could lead to a shakeup in the government, could lead to an assassination attempt against him, and that in desperation, he might try something. I don't think it's a huge chance, but I think it's not insignificant.
So what advice would you be giving the president or the director or whomever would have your ear if you were in the government at this time and this was your portfolio?
I would say that we need to have strong warnings to the Russian government that we will not countenance this. This would be well beyond our red lines. Now, I'm not sure that I'm advocating that we would use nuclear weapons back, but I think we would have to declare that NATO aircraft are going to start patrolling Ukraine. We're going to have to be very tough. The Russians only respond to toughness. And we would have to just, deny, we just say that you're going to have the harshest consequences you can imagine if you use tactical nuclear weapons or any nuclear weapon or chemical weapon for that matter in Ukraine.
So I heard you saying all options on the table, but you would perhaps be recommending something like a no-fly zone,
Yes, exactly.
but
Exactly.
actually being prepared to impose it.
Absolutely.
Rather
No,
than talk about it.
no hollow threats. I mean, we don't want another, remember the red line in Syria? And we don't want that.
Red lines matter, right? So here we are in an audience of what we thought before we met you today was a room full of future lawyers. But as it turns out, perhaps it's a room full of future counter-proliferation officers. What, if you could structure our curriculum here, or you could structure the curriculum at any school to prepare us for the challenges ahead in the counter-proliferation, non-proliferation arena, what should we be teaching? What should we be learning?
I think that certainly a heavy dose of, national security studies and international policy is always helpful. I think studying lessons learned, studying, how did China acquire the bomb? How has, Russia had the Russian intelligence service, to its credit, the predecessor to the KGB was called the NKVD. They had the Manhattan Project absolutely penetrated at every level. And you have to tip your hat to them. They basically stole the designs. They had an indigenous design for a nuclear weapon. And Beria, who is the Russian intelligence chief, the secret police chief, he said, no, we're going to test the American design because we know that works. And we know that if this doesn't go off, it's going to be not only your heads, but my head. So they tested the American design weapon, and I believe it was 1949, and were able to, do fine. And anyways, I would suggest law school is a great background for intelligence work anyways, because you learn how to digest a great volume of information, how to prioritize your time, prioritize your talking points, how to present yourself, heavy dose of analysis, being logical, and then whatever you can increase in briefing skills, I think is always helpful. Those will suit you well, regardless of what field you go into. But being able to logically analyze a great volume of material, I think, is excellent. I always felt like my legal background was excellent preparation for my CIA career, even though I ultimately did not go into the office of general counsel.
Thank you for that. We got on the track of Ukraine through the tactical nuclear weapon door. I was wondering if you might want to comment on 3 to 4 to 5, or perhaps 173 lessons learned about intelligence, Ukrainian use of intelligence, Russian use of intelligence, the US use of intelligence, you choose, in the context of the war against Ukraine.
I can comment more or less on all of those. I think even though we could claim an intelligence success as far as predicting that Putin would invade Ukraine, I think it was also, though, a failure in some respects in that we underestimated the Ukrainians' will and their willingness to resist. We overestimated the Russian military might. And we have, lacked, I guess, some key intelligence sources in the Kremlin. And I think those are all important lessons. We need to penetrate those inner circles. We need to know more about it. We need to absolutely, be conscious of the fact that the Russians have to bear consequences for this aggression. This cannot be a policy of appeasement as it was in the late 30s, where the British and the French were trying to appease Hitler. And we see that dictators are not appeased. They do not go gently into that good night. They're not going to honor an agreement frequently. And so we have to be conscious of that. That requires us to have, frankly, spies, human sources, to know exactly not only what Putin is thinking, what he's planning, what his fallback plans are, as well as his inner circle. For all we know, there could be parts of his inner circle that object to this. Maybe we need to get to them. But I think we've, learned a lot of lessons on and also one other key lesson is how important our intelligence relationship with Ukraine is. I think they would admit that we were in there months ahead of time, training them on basically on insurgency tactics, on how to fight the Russian weapon systems. And that intelligence relationship with Ukraine is absolutely crucial.
Speaking of the topic of current events, I'm sorry to do this to you, but the topic of classified materials and the storage of classified materials has been on the news. What might have happened to you if you had, let me just look in the back there on your bookcase to see, if your bookcase were full of top secret code word documents, what might happen to you?
We'd be having this conversation from my prison cell. And it would be highly irresponsible, whether it was by intention or negligence, to possess the types of documents that were there at Mar-a-Lago. And I wouldn't discount that it might have been negligence, but it's inexcusable, really, especially since some of them were nuclear related. This is our crown jewels frequently, and if it spotted or spotlighted some of our human sources, that's sacrilege to an intelligence officer. Protection of sources and methods, and especially our human sources, is absolutely sacrosanct. And if these documents would finger some of our sources, to me, that is absolutely an atrocity.
Well, you mentioned that there was one person that you recruited and it took you 11 years. So could you give us a sense of how a risk assessment, there's indication that the DNI is leading a risk assessment. Is a risk assessment intended to get at things like, is our source that we took 11 years to recruit at risk? Is that what's going on in a risk assessment? What else might be going on in a risk assessment?
Absolutely. I was in Switzerland right after the arrest of Aldrich Ames. And those of you who are too young to remember, Aldrich Ames had been working for the Russians. He compromised at least 10 Russian intelligence officers and might have given them indications and hints for others. And I was having to what we call exfiltration, where we're actually getting these people out of harm's way. We warn them, do not go back to Russia, or at that time, the Soviet Union. We need to get you, we are not sure if you've been compromised or not, that we need to get you safely to the United States or to a third country where we can protect you, because that's our commitment. When we give a security commitment to our sources, we will go to hell and back to protect them. That is an ironclad commitment. So if when the DNI is doing this damage assessment of these documents that were not being held in a secure facility, but were just simply out in the open, they're going to say, okay, who are the sources of these? I mean, the ultimate, were there human sources involved? And do we need to do something to protect them? What are the chances that these documents were seen by a foreign intelligence service or somebody irresponsible who may have copied them? And that's going to be very difficult to tell, but they'll know who the sources are. It could also be a technical means of collection that was compromised. We saw the grave damage when Edward Snowden defected to the Russians over a decade ago, and he compromised a lot of collection methodologies that we use abroad. And I'm sure that stopped our channels of collection, vital national security collection. So it could be either technical, it could be human. As a human officer, I'm always extremely concerned about our human assets because their lives are on the line.
And if you don't protect them, then the next person's not going to come in and want to work for you. I'm going to leave the Mar-a-Lago documents alone for the moment, unless there are any questions on that. I just wanted to see what we'd get on that particular question. Any follow-up questions from our audience? you mentioned how, let me ask this. Raise your hand if you're familiar with Aldrich Ames. You don't have to acknowledge that you worked with Aldrich Ames, but have you, who that's it? Really interesting. There are roughly, I'm not good at math, but 3 hands went up. One of the things that's so important that Jim reminds us is we need to study our history because we repeat it all the time, or we wish to not repeat it. And one of the things Jim works on is, as Professor Day indicated at the beginning, was insider threat. And insider threat can be a number of things, but Aldrich Ames is a devastating insider threat. And if we don't learn the lessons from what went right or wrong in the Aldrich Ames case, we are doomed to repeat them. Note to self, my class will be discussing Aldrich Ames tomorrow. One of the things that's interesting about your career, Jim, is it spanned what a political science or social scientist might describe as 3 distinct periods of intelligence history and 3 distinct periods of national security history. One being the Cold War, another being the 1990s and a period of transition from U.S. hegemony, perhaps, or the U.S. awakening to counterterrorism and terrorism, and then, of course, the post 9/11 world. So you had the experience on all 3 of those worlds. Can you give our audience a sense of flavor and contrast as between the intelligence work and craft during each of those phases?
When I started in 1980 and up until the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, we were extremely concerned about communism, about the Soviets. And so during the Cold War, which is what it was, we were aimed at each other. It was the CIA versus the KGB. China was just at that point emerging, but becoming an important concern for us. And then we had the second period of when the Soviet Union was falling apart. I remember pitching, by the way, means you're asking somebody to commit espionage. I was pitching some of the Eastern European officers and offering them the chance to come over to our side. And you could tell they were torn because they weren't dyed-in-the-wool communists. Ideologically, they weren't, but they were very tempted to come and work with us. And we did have a lot of successful recruitments among the Eastern Bloc, as well as Russians themselves. They're not invincible. We do recruit them. Then we, after 9/11, it totally changed the context of things. How it affected me, I was in the middle of the AQ Khan operation. I knew that Libya was acquiring nuclear weapons technology, and being a state sponsor of terrorism, boy, that really set the hair on fire of everybody at the White House, the National Security Council, the senior parts of the agency. So I had to accelerate my efforts to bring the Khan network down. It was a fraught time. I think that unfortunately, the intelligence community diverted a lot of resources from our traditional adversaries of Russia and Iran to counterterrorism. Okay, this was necessary at the time. We'd lost 3,000 American citizens on 9/11, but as typical of the United States or anybody, we overreact. And so we ignored the Russian and the Chinese threat. But let me tell you, they did not ignore us. While we were distracted, sometimes we had to be distracted by by Al-Qaeda and the other terrorists. They were basically eating our lunch, and they continue to eat our lunch today. There's more Russian and Chinese intelligence officers and networks in the U.S. than probably ever before. So you were right, it has been 3 distinct periods.
Your comment links in nicely with at least 2 of the questions that we've received from the audience. One is to please comment on the threat from China. And another is when we were serving in government and other organizations, what advice would you give us to prevent or protect us from foreign intelligence collection or from being pitched by them? So you just indicated that Russia and China have very active efforts in the United States to do just that. So the first half of the question is, please comment on China as a national security threat. And the second is, please comment on how I can avoid getting bumped by China or Russia while going about my job.
Well, China is employing massive resources at intelligence collection, both covert and overt. By overt, I mean, well, I say semi-overt, investing in certain US companies in order to acquire intellectual property and also stealing intellectual property. The FBI is overwhelmed by Chinese efforts to steal not only high technology, but things like more productive seeds. Now you think, well, how interesting can seeds be? Well, they're very, for production of agricultural crops and things like that. Our big agricultural companies spend billions of dollars on developing certain seed strains and things like that. Or our pharmaceutical companies spend billions of dollars in developing pharmaceuticals, and the Chinese would like to get it for free. So they would infiltrate and try and steal, suborn somebody, to recruit someone to sell them or give them this, and they will reward such a source handsomely. The FBI is constantly dealing with this, and I'm talking about every part of the United States, from the things that you would think are not interesting to things that are really, crucial to our national security. And of course, you think seeds aren't interesting? Well, they're crucial to our national security. We need to have food. And so there's a lot of areas where the Chinese, I jokingly tell my FBI colleagues, I said, it's almost like human wave attacks in the Korean War, where they are just coming at us constantly. As far as if you are ever pitched by an intelligence officer or you feel like you've been pitched, we always tell our employees that you need to firmly reject the pitch. You need to tell people that no and be unambiguous about it, because if you don't come back with a firm no, I'm not going to do that, they will note it and they will mean maybe he's thinking about it, and they will come back at you and pitch you again. And so that's one thing, is reject the pitch, and then you should say, and I'm going to report this. So
Take it one, you're not pitched yet. Someone's just friendly. Should we treat all people as hostile actors until proven otherwise?
No, of course not. But if something is too good to be true, it's usually too good to be true.
So that's pretty good advice there. The too good to be true rule.
Right. I was in the business of recruiting sources just like this, and I would lead them sometimes down a path of just gradually turning up the heat. The old saying about you don't put frogs in boiling water, you put them in lukewarm water, you gradually turn up the heat, and you get them compromising themselves. And I mean, this is the same tactics that I would use against targets that they use. And so be aware that sometimes it's not your charming, your good looks and your charm that are getting you these friends, especially if you have access to some highly restricted or privileged information. It could be in a company or it could be in the government.
Your point before about seeds, it does suggest, I like the point that if you work at Monsanto, or if you're a research assistant at Syracuse working on something interesting, one has to take a moment and consider who might else find it interesting. I heard that message loud and clear, which doesn't mean you should stop working on it, but you might want to take some better cyber protection and measures as well. I have a question while I catch up on the audience questions. I wanted to ask you about the importance of a diversity in the intelligence community and in your work. We run a grant here at Syracuse to increase diversity in the intelligence community workforce. And we do that in part because we believe diversity is good for national security. But can you take that argument and develop it a bit and talk about why it's important to your line of work?
Well, it's only logical that our adversaries do not all look and talk like me. These people are every race, every color, every religion under the sun, and they tend to think differently than I do. And so we need to have a diverse workforce that knows what it's like. I mean, for one thing, we need greater language skills, absolutely much more diverse language skills. And we need people that culturally know what it's like, that these people in these foreign countries are like. And finally, we need intellectual diversity, not simply racial or gender diversity, but intellectual diversity. I think it's a certain amount of contrarian thinking, absolutely a heavy dose of creativity. I guess I was a contrarian in a sense because our deputy director of operations, Jim Pavitt, would sometimes include me in meetings, and he'd go around the room and they'd be discussing an operation. And then towards the end, he'd turn to me and he'd say, "Jim, give me a different point of view." And I never failed him. I usually had a different point of view. And so to have that intellectual diversity in addition to ethnic and religious and racial diversity, I think is critical to being able to understand our adversaries, to be able to preserve our national security. We're not just doing this. It makes good sense.
Two of the questions, I'll let you package it as you wish. They're not necessarily related. I'm not relating them necessarily, but I'll give you a couple of them and then you can deal with them as you wish. Please comment, if you would, on the nuclear threat from North Korea. And we saw that law-abiding country just last week passed a law authorizing the use of nuclear weapons, as if that were at issue. And also someone has asked if you would comment on Joshua Schulte and the Vault 7 leak.
So North Korea has always been a very difficult target. They're not impossible. And I mentioned one of my abroad called the hard targets branch, which I found highly insulting because I thought, so the rest of us are working on soft targets? What do you
hang on, you're something's going on with your comms. Try again, please.
I said I don't believe in hard targets. I believe in hard access. And with the North Koreans, they are people with the same hurts, wants, desires, Maslow's hierarchy. And the difficult thing is coming up with new creative approaches to get close to them and to recruit people that have on in Pyongyang, what is Kim Jong-un's circle of advisors. These people have been brainwashed for years, but we do recruit North Koreans, and we need to have more successful North Koreans. It scares me that North Korea has not only proven nuclear weapons, but they're rapidly advancing in their delivery systems to where now they have delivery systems that could reach the United States. That's frightening. That's absolutely frightening. And I think it shows a failure on the intelligence community's part that we have not been able to get ahead of that to a greater extent. Now, your second question, if you could refresh.
Yes, it has to do with the Vault 7 release of, yeah.
It's my
you can comment as you see fit. You're not required to comment on all matters.
Okay. I know there's a criminal case.
Why don't, for the audience, might you refer them at least to an article or something that will tell them that what Vault 7 is? So it's the article doing the talking rather than you.
I don't have the site in front of me, but I know that he had access at CIA to some of our most effective cyber tools and was a designer himself, a very smart guy, very strange. He had a lot of personality issues, he was a difficult person to work with, got into physical fights with fellow employees, and he was kind of a ticking time bomb that probably should have been detected much earlier due to his totally aberrant behavior. But yes, he had in his possession sophisticated cyber tools that we have in our war chest, and that's what was called Vault 7. And now he's being prosecuted for that, as well as possession of child pornography, and was well, anyways, I'm not sure that we have any proof that he transmitted those sensitive tools to a foreign power, but they're definitely looking at, he's in custody, fortunately, and can't communicate those things, but it was a very serious breach.
There's a number of long articles on this, including one in the New Yorker. Neither Jim nor I would be in a position to be able to affirm or not affirm any of the information, but that's a place to start if you want to read more.
Absolutely.
Career advice. You've given some really good career advice. Looking back on your career, and I would like to note that your career goes on, your service to the country has not stopped, but you have retired from one area. What is something you know now that you wish you knew then, that you wish you didn't spend 25 years learning or 30 years learning? And you can spare us in this room the 25 years you took to learn it.
I think I would have been more aggressive, more of a risk taker. I have a definition of lucky people. I think everybody in life gets, over time, gets equal opportunities at things, but there's a small subset of people who not only can perceive an opportunity for what it is, an opportunity, but then will seize the opportunity. There were probably some times in my career where I should have been a little more perceptive or a little more willing to take that risk. In fact, a very good friend of mine, our former deputy director, Steve Kappas, says, he said, you know, operations officers are willing to risk their lives, but not their careers. And I thought that's true. That's sadly true in many, many cases. They're willing to risk our lives, but not our careers. Probably more aggressive, a little more willing to put myself out there, get out of my comfort zone, just not settle into a niche. And yeah, I think that's probably what I would have told myself back when I started.
Which is advice that you might provide in any career path, not just the career path that you were in. Okay, what did you enjoy most in your career, and what did you enjoy least? I'll note that one of the things that got me laughing about this book, and it's a story about, and it's a novel. It's a story about the Iranian nuclear weapons program and a clandestine effort to obtain a nuclear weapon. So that's not an hilarious kind of thing. That didn't get me laughing. But what got me laughing was there's a lot of bureaucratic stuff in there. And there's a couple of people who are absolute careerists. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I think I know who he's talking about. And one of the people in question is called Charlie Grable. And I'm thinking, oh, I know Charlie Grable. And tell us a couple of the lessons about working in a bureaucracy. And we all work in bureaucracies in some way or another. What's an effective way to do it? What's an ineffective way to do it? How do we get more Jim Lawlers and fewer Charlie Grables?
That's a great question, Jamie. You asked me what I enjoyed most about my career. It was the operations. That's why I continue to write espionage novels, because now I can live vicariously through my characters that I create. What I enjoyed the least was, in fact, the bureaucracy, the careerists. The Russians have a word for this. They're called the apparatchiki, the people who are part of the apparatus, part of the bureaucracy, the careerists, the person that is not doing this for our national security, but they're looking at their own career. And I used to despise that. But, oh, sure, you need to be mindful of your career, but people who are ruthless, that want to take credit for things that they contribute nothing to, who are simply out for themselves. I mean, that is a real recipe for distrust and disaster. And I was, dealing with people like that, you have to just be very careful. Not necessarily, but to learn to work around them or get them on your side. They're not necessarily stupid people. So in essence, you philosophically recruit them to be part of the team, be part of your effort, give them credit. We used to use a lot of in our operations, a lot of cyber tools to produce intelligence. We'd penetrate someone's computer and produce intelligence. And my philosophy on overcoming any resistance from the stations abroad was, if we did an operation on your turf in your station's area of responsibility, we would give you credit for the intelligence reports that we generated. I didn't need the credit, but that made the local station chiefs absolutely delighted that they were getting credit for work they didn't have to do. So being able to meet their needs and somehow advance your own needs, you can make this a win-win.
Which reminds me of President Truman's quip, which was, it's amazing what you can get done in government if you don't care who gets the credit.
Absolutely.
And you've given it the Lawler codicil, which is, or when you share the credit. Something to keep in mind. This question I'm going to put aside for a minute and deal with that on the side for whoever gave it. So the career. Oh, one thing I'd like to follow up. We talk about this all the time. You seem to indicate there's the same phrase occurs in the military. I'm prepared to die for my country, but not to sacrifice my career. And this gets at the distinction between what is physical courage and what is moral courage. And Field Marshal Slim and President Kennedy both made the exact same remark, almost with the exact same words, which is, of the two forms of courage, physical and moral, the far rarer is moral courage. One is, I take it that was your experience in government as well. And two, you comment on that as you see fit. And two, how do we teach moral courage? What is the best way to instill in us the moral courage we will need to take on the challenges ahead? And boy, there are many.
Great question, Jamie. I had a very, very distinguished mentor in my career. It started in 1980 when I went to our training facility at the farm. His name is Gary Schrone. Gary Schrone just passed away at the end of July. Gary Schrone was my mentor at the farm and has been my mentor throughout my career. CIA forces into Afghanistan 15 days after 9/11. The man is probably the most decorated CIA officer.
So Jim, you're coming in and out. I don't want the audience to miss what you're saying. It's very important. So can you just back up about 5 seconds?
Yeah, Gary Schrone led our CIA forces into Afghanistan 15 days after 9/11. I used to call him CIA's Audie Murphy. Audie Murphy was the most decorated soldier in World War II. And like Audie Murphy, he was a rather compact man, modest. If you were around him, you would never think this guy was the one who won all of those awards and medals. And Gary taught me from an early time that the most fundamental, absolutely the most important thing in your career is integrity. Your ability to look at yourself in the mirror in the morning and know that you've done the right thing. And I think that was an invaluable lesson, to tell the truth, because like any relationship, intelligence. We had a Russian intelligence officer who had defected to us, and we asked him, how do we recruit someone like you? And he said, well,
oh, no, go back. It's too important. We couldn't hear that part. I want to hear the part. How do we recruit someone like you? And you're about to tell us the answer, and we don't want to miss it.
So this Russian said, you have to be a serious fellow, Seryozny Chilovek, a serious person. I'm putting my life and my liberty in your hands. And if I perceive that you're a lightweight or that you're not sincere, He says, I will not talk to you. I'm not going to volunteer to you. So being serious, being sincere. Sometimes people say that CIA officers are trained liars. I am not a trained liar. I don't lie. I may not tell you the whole truth, everything, when I'm recruiting somebody, but I'm always try to be sincere. So I'm not deceiving anyone.
For the audience, Gary Schroen was in retirement, and he was called back into active service after 9/11, and 15 days after 9/11 led the first team into Afghanistan. He recently passed away, and there's a story in today's Washington Post on him if you're interested. So you can just Google that as well. So I think I'm going to translate that in terms of moral courage. Is you have to be able to look at yourself in the mirror every day and say, I did the right thing. And in your case, and in my case, I hope, the identification of role models was critical. And you've in identifying the correct role model rather than the Charlie Grable role model. So Gary Schroen was not, Charlie Grable was not based on Gary Schroen, I take it. Charlie Grable is the careerist in this book, who is the person who is doing everything wrong and getting in the way, putting his career first. We're almost at our end point. And so I'm going to do two things at this point. I'm going to say, are there any last minute questions? Anybody in the audience about, oh, yes, good. 1 and 2, why don't you both say your question and then we'll see if we can package it.
As a OIF vet, I'm particularly interested in what you think the missteps were in the intelligence community, this mistaken assessment of WFDs in Iraq, and what type of bulwarks we put in place to prevent such failures in the future.
Okay, fair question. Other question, please.
Sir, in regards to Russian storage of nuclear weapons, since the fall of the Soviet Union, obviously they've been in maintaining and handling all of the stockpiles, and to boost these devices would have had to have been replaced 2 to 3 times. Based on what we've seen in Ukraine with the poor level of maintenance, what they're at and what effects would that have on?
Sure. Jim, were you able to hear both questions?
The second question tended to break up. I think I got the gist of it, but should we be concerned about, considering the poor state of equipment that the Russians' military equipment, should we be concerned about, I guess, nuclear weapons integrity that's in Russia? And
Fair.
I think we need to be concerned about that. In fact, I know that Department of Energy has had exchanges with the Russians on, not only protection, but making sure that their weapons are well maintained. The grasp of that. Certain nations that are developing nuclear weapons do not. There's things I can't get into because it's restricted data, but some of the third at making nuclear weapons are absolutely frightening. They do not have a good grasp of some of the physical principles and some of the criticality issues, things that could set a nuclear weapon off by complete mistake, complete accident. I think the Russian weapons.
You think the Russian weapons, what? We lost that.
I think they're safe.
Okay, that we wanted the punchline. We wanted to know whether we're heading down to the bunker or not. And then the other question was, please comment on Iraqi WMD intelligence matters.
I think there was, unfortunately, a certain degree of careerism involved of some of the analysts we had a case of Saddam Hussein. He's a bad guy. He had demonstrably had weapons of mass destruction before the Iraq War. We know he used the gas against his own population, against the Kurds, killed with chemical weapons against the Iranians. Was working on, for whatever reason, he no longer had them, and yet he lives
A
you know,
little closer to your mic, please.
was in a tough neighborhood, and he unfortunately was posturing as if he did have weapons of mass destruction. But we had no evidence, no smoking gun evidence that he really did. And they were grasping at straws. And I think they were pandering to an administration invade Iraq. And therefore, they would take some of these slender threads of so-called evidence and blow this up. I was in a position where I knew exactly who our destruction was. And I asked one time at a senior staff meeting whether there was some super sensitive compartment of intelligence to which I was not privy that had the smoking gun casus belli. Fellow senior looked at me and they laughed and they said, "The train's left the station, Jim."
I think we got the gist of that. Did you? Yeah. Well, that was a very candid answer. I regret that we're at the end of our time period. People will start going to class soon. Jim, on behalf of our audience, on behalf of Syracuse University, thank you, of course, for your time today. Thank you even more, of course, for all that you and your team did to provide for our security. And in an area that no one can have debate is vital to world security as well as U.S. national security, which is the counter-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Thank you very much, audience.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And we look forward to reading your next book.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.